Thank you, Patricia, and good day to everybody. And of course, thanks and congratulations to the organizer of the Congress that despite all difficulties, managed to brought all of us here together. So congratulations and well done. So climate change. Climate change is a complex challenge, and therefore I don't have the ambition to go into depth in all the different facets of which climate change impinge into animal health, food safety, the safety of products of animal origin, or the livestock sector as a whole. But I would like to give a kind of birth-high view on how all this information gets together, and not only what are the implications for the sector, but also how the livestock sector can bring solution to mitigate climate change. So not only looking at the problem, but also looking at giving some positive information of what we as professionals working in this sector can do to address and the challenge of climate change. So climate change causes, it's quite well known, and Matthew Stone was giving quite a wealth of information on how climate change causes damage to our ecosystem. But while the impact on natural resources, agriculture, and also food security is quite well known, the effect of animal health on the safety of products of animal origin and on the livestock sector as a whole receive less attention. Even though, I mean, the implications are much wider. I mean, it's not only, they're not important for the animal per se, for the food, but also they have implications for international trade, for livelihood of the people living out of those animals, and for the whole economy of the sector. So what are we talking about when we talk about climate change? So of course, we're looking at changing weather patterns, increasing temperature, altered precipitation patterns, melting glaciers and therefore rising the sea level, ocean warming, acidification, more frequent extreme weather events like flooding, the severe drought, and the wildfire, but also indirect effect like changes in the water quality, for instance, so what we've seen because of the proliferation of certain algae, so having an implication for aquatic animals. Also how the vector ecology is changing, the changes in the ecosystem, in the agricultural system and so on, and also some social and economic disruption, how we've seen also from the presentation of Carmen Savello, human behavior may change because of climate change, the consumption, the food consumption patterns, the cooking habits, and so on. So all of these has an effect on the sector in which we work. So what are the specific effects on animal health? The disease emergency in animals and the human-animal interface may change. The changes in temperature, precipitation, and other environmental factors may affect the geographical distribution, the life cycle, and the persistence of pathogens and parasites. So this graph shows a little bit all the different interactions, and one we really we have to talk about kind of a web of interlinkages that affect one to the other. What are the diseases which are most affected by climate change? Of course, the ones which are carried from insect pests, ecto and endoparasite, arthropod-borne diseases, but also very much the feed-borne. As we will see later, a lot of contaminants, feed contaminants, may increase because of climate change, and those in turn has an effect on the animals directly, but also on the safety of products of animal origin. The climate impact enhance or decrease the introduction in the invasion of disease agents, but also has an impact on the demography of humans and animals, on encroachment of the natural resources bases, the land use, the agricultural system, also the greater mobility of people or the reduced mobility of people, and the dense trade and the volume of the traffic. It influenced the disease ecology and the pathogen evolution, but also increased the presence of hazard in feed, as I was saying before, and the produce of animal origin, and may increase also the use of antimicrobials and antimicrobial resistance. You all know, and it was also shown in one of the slides of Matthew Stone's, as the increase of antimicrobial resistance is one of the big threats we're facing today, together with the climate change and other major ones. And of course, by having increased disease and also the resistance of those pathogens may increase, and we in turn increase the resistance of to antimicrobials. Yes, just to show, for instance, how this is just a slide that shows how the different scenario, how, for instance, mycotoxin, more specifically aflatoxin contamination, may change because of climate change. As we know, mycotoxin are increasing because of the temperature rise, humidity, and also because of damages to the crops. So this different scenario shows how the contamination may increases the geographical presence. And again, in turn, this will need increase the use of fungicides, for instance, and this in turn might increase the resistance to those antimicrobials. So just to give an example on how the different changes can be quantified. How to cope with the mitigation and the negative consequences of climate change. As I was saying at the beginning, I don't want to give only information on what are the challenges, but also what can be done to prevent the problems or to mitigate them. So preventing veterinary medicine, of course, but also the adjustment of animal production systems and making them more resilient and more sustainable to mitigate climate change, and also how to increase the social resilience. Preventing veterinary medicine, early warning, early detection, early response, preventing the spread of diseases across borders, but also the application of progressive control pathway, again being mentioned in the presentation before. When we look about the adjustment of animal production systems, when we improve sanitation, animal hygiene in animal husbandry, biosecurity, we are putting we are using means and tools to decrease the possibility of diseases affecting the animals, but also very much the use of adapted animal genetic resources. So local breeds, for instance, or adapted breeds that make the animals more resistant and resilient to certain diseases. Improve animal nutrition. There's several studies that show how healthy gut microbiome can improve the resistance and resilience of the animals. So for instance, making them less prone to get diseases. The good use of animal feeding practices. Again, having less chances of having feed contaminated with certain pathogens and making animals more resistant. Ensure animal welfare cannot be stressed enough. How an animal which is less stressed, in better animal welfare condition, is in turn more resistant to diseases. Addressing also all the agroecological resilience pattern and develop and implement new specific strategies for climate change adaptation and mitigation in the livestock sector, reducing, for instance, the livestock enteric methane emission. How do we do? How to decrease, how to make low carbon livestock, how to decrease the impact. For instance, increasing the efficiency of livestock production and resources use, improving the productivity of animal production, and reduce, therefore, the emission intensities. increasing the carbon sequestration through improved grazing management, improving the quality of pasture, and improving animal nutrition. There is a wealth of feed additives, for instance, that will enable animals to increase the digestive efficiency. So therefore, being able to feed in low quality resources and the pasture and grazing areas, and therefore increasing the possibilities of carbon sequestration, but also better livestock integration in the circular economies, in intensifying the recycling efforts and minimizing the losses, for instance. And again, just to give an example of how all these issues are interconnected, it has been shown, for instance, that animals which are less stressed decrease, so therefore with a lower cortisol level, that give rise to less methane emission. So just one example on how, for instance, increasing the welfare could help mitigating the climate change through lower livestock emission. And it has been also quite well documented how silvopastoral systems, and there are several examples, for instance, from Latin American countries, Colombia and Mexico, can not only support the health and the welfare of the animals, but also help to increase biodiversities, and in turn having an effect in mitigation of climate change. Social resistance, again, empowering the communities vis-a-vis their health protection, strengthening the health system and the infrastructure, making efforts to have outreach activities which are community-based, increasing the participatory disease surveillance and control, addressing the behavioral changes, and providing improvements in the food and income security, in turn, enable the people, the owners of the animals, the people in the livestock sector, to take better care of their animals and upgrading the livestock production and farming systems. So just looking at the different facets all together. So when we do that, when we talk about that, we are just applying a One Health and One Welfare approaches. I think by now we're all aware and we all recognize the importance of One Welfare and One Welfare approaches, but I think it's never enough, and it should be always re-emphasized how important it is dealing with the complex risk factors as a whole, acting throughout the nature and farming landscape, land use, the maintenance of biodiversity, the work on farm, the work in slaughterhouses, and the processing and distribution circuits, in a way that brings together all health professionals. The veterinarians, of course, the public health, feed, food safety professionals, agriculture, forestry, fisheries, plant pathologists, land use, natural resource managers, and of course all those social scientists, communication specialists, human behavior and behavioral changes professionals. We can never stress enough how it's important that all those figures join hands, and removing all the divide among disciplines, sectors, institutions, and political boundaries. It has been said over and over again how human health, the health of the animals, and the health of the ecosystem in which they exist have to be addressed together. So now, just to conclude, it has to be re-emphasized that climate change is causing unprecedented damage to our ecosystem. But again, while we address in an important manner from looking at the impact on natural resources and agriculture, so therefore food security, still we don't give enough attention on its effect on animal health, the safety of product of animal origin, and the livestock sector as a whole. What is needed? We need to have intelligence gathered, forward-looking approaches, horizon scanning, foresight, but also sharing all the gathered reliable information and to have a better understanding of the consequences of climate change, recognizing the value of One Health and One Welfare approach as a global common good, calling for stronger international solidarity and cooperation, building sustainable and resistant animal production system that, as I was saying, can mitigate the effect of climate change, but also strengthening those health systems and for all countries. And when I say country, I mean not only the national competent authorities, but also all the stakeholders in a sector together with the intergovernmental organization, the financial institution, and so on, to act as a whole and develop together new strategies to face global threats as climate change. And with that, I just would like to remind that many of the information I've mentioned is taken from FAO publication. Just these three are just a few examples of what is available, the information available at FAO. They're all available online, so just easy to Google. But of course, if you need more information and reference, you can get in touch with me. And with that one, I would like to thank you all for your attention and looking forward to fruitful conversation and discussion in the panel section. Thanks again for the attention.
Thank you, Patricia, and kia ora tātou to all my colleagues and friends in New Zealand, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to veterinary colleagues around the world. In the next 20 minutes, I'd like to give you a brief introduction to the OIE, look quickly at the issues that we know that are facing us in terms of the livestock sector and the demand for food, explore climate change and how it affects disease dynamics, and in particular the drivers of disease emergence, and then look at the adaptation toolkit, the enablers for strong veterinary services. And we'll finish off with the investment case for veterinary services, because we know that in many parts of the world, investment is required. So the OIE is the World Organization for Animal Health. Our strategic plan gives us our mandate in three particular areas: animal health, animal welfare, veterinary public health, risk management. The official data on animal health status that various countries send to us, and we verify and aggregate and send out, disseminate internationally, and our capability building for veterinary services internationally. And this mandate is underpinned by the cross-cutting areas of scientific excellence, diversity, engagement, transparency, and strong governance. A great introduction to the OIE is through our annual reports. These numbers come from our 2018 report. The 2019 report is about to be published. We have currently 182 member countries. We operate on a budget of around about 30 million a year. You can see some of our activities and numbers here, the standards that we're working on, our modus operandi of running expert groups, global conferencing, and the training and capacity building services that we operate. So the International Panel on Climate Change, I hope you've all discovered their amazing website with such a wealth of information. These graphs are taken from one of their reports focused on the scenario of 1.5 degree change in the future. You can see how that's modeled in the graph on the left-hand screen. But in particular, I think I'll draw your attention to the two graphs on the right-hand side, and noting that this one looks at the reasons for concern, and we can get a view of the sorts of impacts that we can expect globally, and also we can look at the different ecosystems or the different natural managed and human systems that are affected. I'll come back to this because it's in particular the aquatic and the coastal areas that are going to be some of the hardest hit areas. And I want to very briefly touch on these issues for aquaculture. Okay, so the world's worried that manifests in these global risk reports where we can see a changing, a growing recognition even from the broad interests across business about this threat. And the OIE has been examining our service offering for our members and looking at what we have to offer. And you can see that summary. And I'm going to touch on some of these things here. Last year in 2019, we used foresight in a process where we engaged our membership and their stakeholders in exploring what are the external factors that create challenges for veterinary services internationally. And we can see across the x-axis here a wide range of threats and opportunities facing veterinary services internationally. Of course, some of these are directly related to climate change, such as weather events. We know emerging disease and the threat of pandemics, of course. Also issues around biodiversity. You can see here in this graph where our member countries, the veterinary services themselves, position these challenges in terms of what they considered to be most important, and also with interesting divergence in some areas where the stakeholders were viewing these issues and considering them. But let's start with infectious disease and introduce this idea of climate-sensitive diseases. And of course, this has a specific local risk and threat context. We know that our survey told us that some of our members are starting to, they're producing not just the lists of notifiable diseases, but they're also examining those diseases, both endemic and potentially exotic, that they would consider climate sensitive. They're typically climate sensitive because of the impact on transmission dynamics from, in particular, temperature and how that interacts with the epidemiological triad of pathogens, vectors, and the environment. But why? Why create a list of climate-sensitive diseases? Well, this gives us some focus. It gives us focus for heightening surveillance and monitoring efforts, focus for preparedness, and focus for food system adaptations to reduce vulnerability. The vector-borne diseases are, of course, a big focus area here, and they are a global issue. At some stage, it would have been easy to imagine that vector-borne diseases were focused around tropical and subtropical areas, but we know more and more we're seeing in temperate zones incursions of invasive species. And what's driving this? Well, there are a range of environmental, sociological, and economical factors driving these. And this, of course, is driving disease emergence. Just to quickly highlight, I'm not going to dwell on these, some of the vector-borne diseases that we're ensuring that the data that members send to us is aggregated and presented back to us. So these next slides draw on the presentation on global animal health status that was made last year in 2019 to our World Assembly, looking at Rift Valley fever and its impact in the sub-Saharan and central zones and the Rift Valley of Africa, a classic example of a climate-driven disease with previously quite predictable cycles of endemic and then epidemic cycles. But those cycles are becoming harder to predict. West Nile fever as well, now almost very well distributed around the world, but still spreading into new zones. And so even in the last 2 years, zones in the Mediterranean region are now demonstrating their first occurrences of West Nile fever. Blue tongue as well, another vector-borne disease, and its impact in particular, again, the Mediterranean zone with new serotypes expanding their previous range. But let's not forget other diseases like avian influenza, a disease with an extremely complex epidemiology involving migratory birds, of course, and the climatic impacts that potentially affect their wintering and their breeding zones and their behaviour in terms of flyways. Means that this is another disease where the OIE is ensuring that we're producing regular and frequent up-to-date situation reports tracking this disease. And of course, we're bringing to bear the scientific network of OFFLU, our collaboration between OEE and FAO, to ensure that there is a strong network of scientists providing good guidance about technical standards, including, for instance, the vaccine strains and the seasonal vaccine strains that are incorporated. So this information is passed over to WHO for their seasonal flu. Now, on to aquaculture, and this is an area where disease emergence is so strong and such a concern. Over the last few years, there have been numerous diseases that have emerged in aquaculture, and the drivers for that are very well known. And as we said before, we throw the climate change impacts into the coastal and aquatic areas here, and we know that disease emergence and support for the aquaculture sector to ensure that we're addressing these drivers and supporting the sector, which has now overtaken wild harvest fisheries in terms of provision of food supply. Okay, so the factors driving disease emergence are relatively well known, but they're actually, I thought they were beautifully summarised in this diagram on the left by the United Nations Environment Programme, a diagram that's just been presented in the context of what we believe to be some of the causal factors associated with COVID-19 and its emergence. In fact, it's interesting to juxtapose this diagram here with this one, which is taken from OEE's Ebo-Circe project, which looks at Ebola and other hemorrhagic fevers as they affect 10 countries in Central and West Africa, and looking at the actors in the surveillance chain, from hunters to community animal health workers and veterinarians, laboratory technicians, bringing those actors together to strengthen surveillance systems for these diseases that are threatened to emerge from wildlife reservoirs. In fact, the factors driving disease emergence were beautifully summarised in this presentation from Dr. Kamran Khan, who's the chief executive for Blue Dot, a Canadian big data company, working primarily in public health. He spoke at the OEE's conference on One Health and Big Data last year in Sardinia, for the Mediterranean region. A really nice summary here, and his presentation also emphasised how big data and artificial intelligence is currently being used, how the sorts of information that we're all able to receive can be triaged and structured into information that can inform the work that's going on internationally to track disease emergence. And just a brief divergence into the COVID-19, and I'm sure you're all following the dashboard that Johns Hopkins University has set up, a fantastic collaboration, an international collaboration to bring that data together. I hope too that you're aware of the GISAID platform and the fact that now through a major scientific collaboration, that platform has been able to bring together over 3,000 whole COVID-19 genomes and demonstrate the international molecular epidemiology of the event very much in real time. So the way that we're able to exploit these new technologies to help us track and respond to disease emergence is incredibly important. Another very important piece of work, and this one was presented by Professor Jonathan Rushton from University of Liverpool at the same conference in Sardinia last year, but it reflects work over the last 2 years around a project called the Global Burden of Animal Disease, which has as an ambition to build a community of practitioners operating standardized methodologies for economic impact analysis, so that we can move from the sort of crude, ad hoc, single disease, single point in time estimates that we currently have across the diseases to a much more richer environment of data, akin to what is now serving public health internationally. This is a screenshot from the Global Burden of Disease, which is a collaboration between the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation and World Health Organization. With the long-time support, this is work that's been built up over 2 or 3 decades by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to provide the degree of granularity around the health impacts broken down by non-infectious, infectious, and accident-related methodologies. So coming back to this broad array of factors that impact veterinary services internationally, and we can really see this, we can start to position this and the need for veterinary services to be a player, a strategic player with their national governments to help strengthen national and international readiness and response across this range of threats, but also to capitalize on the opportunities within here. And we need to see this whole set as very much an adaptive challenge. And if you're not familiar with that terminology, just to juxtapose what we consider a technical challenge, and you can see how that's defined here. There's the experts, you turn to experts here to solve these problems, but adaptive challenges are much harder, and the solutions to these have to emerge from group processes where we all work together to consider the many threats and respond to them. And sustainability and sustainable development very clearly falls into this framework of an adaptive challenge. So how is the OIE, what are the services that the OIE is offering to our members and encouraging our members to adopt? And so I just want to, in the next few slides, just very quickly look at some of the enabling factors that are going to support veterinary services. And the first one, of course, is the interdisciplinary approach and the systems thinking. And whether we're talking about antimicrobial resistance or infectious diseases like tuberculosis or avian influenza, or in fact climate change itself, these photos across the bottom, we know that bringing it interdisciplinary thinking together is absolutely crucial. And where we've started there is in particular the work that veterinarians in the public health sector are doing together, because we know that strengthening veterinary services and strengthening public health services goes hand in hand. And the OIE, working with the World Health Organization, has a very strong framework of training, what we call One Health bridging workshops, which have been rolled out in many countries across the developing world to bring these agencies, the actors together, to work together on identified priorities such as rabies or any other emerging neglected tropical or emerging diseases. Very action orientated. In terms of strengthening veterinary services, specifically, the OIE's PVS pathway has recently been revamped. The diagram on the left describes it. I kind of hope you're a little bit familiar with the work that the OIE does in the performance of veterinary services pathway to guide our members and their veterinary services through a structured evaluation and planning and targeted support program. And this has been rolled out to many countries around the world now. And finally, public-private partnerships. So at the government level, between the private sector, international organisations and civil society. The frameworks for public-private partnerships are absolutely critical. And recently, again with the support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we've worked to develop a typology and some of PPPs and some guidance about when they're appropriate and the sorts of considerations that need to be thought through when you're setting up public-private partnerships. Now, bringing all this together, we're making the case and we're advocating for investment in animal health systems. And we're doing this obviously in relationship to the Sustainable Development Goals, identifying the contributions that veterinary systems, veterinary services make to those Sustainable Development Goals, and working with our donor community to help us to undertake those capacity building activities internationally in veterinary services. So, to finish with a few conclusions. We know that climate change creates risks for human health, animal health, and food security, but it's just one of many adaptive challenges facing veterinary services. It does set up a complex and dynamic international epidemiological situation, and that requires ongoing research and focused effort. Right now we have some predictive capacity, but the complexity and the uncertainty affect our understanding and the likely scenarios that are going to play out here. Health services strengthening is a key enabler for risk mitigation and management, and veterinary services face capacity challenges in many parts of the developing world. Veterinary services need our support, encouragement, and training to fully understand their role in addressing threats and opportunities. And this requires ongoing commitment to develop support, an ongoing commitment to development support, collaboration, regulatory convergence, and harmonisation around international standards. And so to do that, we need to merge the scientific basis for risk management with the political, the economic, and the cultural and technical considerations to support the investment in terrestrial and aquatic animal health. Now, just I'll leave you with, and I know that all these presentations are going to be shared, so I wanted to just as a takeaway, an early look at our strategic plan for the next 5 years. I'll leave you with that. You can review that in your own time. And I want to, there's some live links to some of the various resources that we've drawn from and the OEE has created in this area. And finally, acknowledge the various OEE and other colleagues that have are involved in the various work that I've touched on here. Thank you.
Many thanks for that introduction, and thanks as well to all the organizers for your efforts to put together this summit. It's great that we still have this chance to connect with each other, even if we can't be physically together in New Zealand as originally planned. So with that, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining from around the world today. My name is indeed Carmen Savelli from the World Health Organization. And I'm very happy to be with you today, as introduced, to talk a bit about climate change and foodborne diseases. Many of you are probably familiar with the World Health Organization and already know that it's the directing and coordinating authority on international health within the United Nations system. And our organization has more than 7,000 people working in 150 different country offices, 6 regional offices, and at our headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland, which is pictured here. So, of course, right now, many of our staff are currently working on the COVID-19 response, but the organization's responsibilities are really much broader than just this kind of emergency response, and they cover all aspects of health. So, from a big picture perspective, we say that WHO works to provide worldwide to promote health, to keep the world safe, and to serve the vulnerable. And this includes addressing all kinds of health issues relating to the food that we eat every day. And of course, that's because access to sufficient amounts of safe and nutritious food is key to sustaining life and to promoting good health. But unfortunately, unsafe food that contains harmful bacteria and viruses or parasites and chemical substances can cause more than 200 different diseases. And these diseases really range in their severity, some of them causing only mild gastrointestinal upset, others more severe forms of diarrhea. But then we also have the diseases that cause more severe outcomes like blindness or paralysis or other long-term sequelae, and even some forms of cancer. And unfortunately, in some of these cases, the outcome is fatal. So in fact, the global burden of foodborne disease is quite significant. And we have an estimated 600 million people getting sick from unsafe food each year. And that translates to almost 1 in 10 people worldwide getting sick. And unfortunately, 420,000 of those people die. It's also important to note that the burden of foodborne disease is unequally distributed around the world, with the largest burden falling on those living in Asia and Africa. In addition to this significant disease burden, a recent World Bank study has indicated that the impact of unsafe food costs low and middle income economies about $110 billion in lost productivity and medical expenses each year. And the thing is, a large proportion of these costs could be avoided by adopting preventative measures that improve the way that food is produced and processed and distributed and handled all along the food chain. So now to add climate change to the discussion, with all of its complexities and uncertainties, what we can say is that climate change is expected to have a considerable impact on food safety, both directly and indirectly, placing public health at risk, including from foodborne diseases. Several studies have actually shown that the climate variables most influencing foodborne diseases are displayed here. You have increased air temperature, water temperature, and precipitation. So these are the ones that I'm going to focus on in the next few minutes. These three climate variables affect foodborne diseases through various mechanisms, and I'm going to highlight three of them during this presentation, starting with the first one about abundance, growth, range, and survival of pathogens and other microorganisms, and then talk about some human exposure factors, and then we'll get into some transmission factors. So first, as I said, the abundance, growth, range, and survival of pathogens and other microorganisms will be affected by climate change throughout the food chain, and it could have an impact on crops, on livestock, on the environment. And so here's a few examples of how these interactions may affect some specific foodborne hazards. So first, as an example, we could look at the survival of E. coli, which can cause serious foodborne disease. And this is dependent on temperature, moisture, and interactions with the microbial community. And we would see greater growth at higher temperatures, of course, within limits. So we could expect then to see more E. coli infections with climate change. Next, mycotoxins. So mycotoxins are produced by fungi growing in crops like corn and cereal grains, and they're able to proliferate with increased air temperature, humidity, precipitation. And the most toxic mycotoxins, the aflatoxins, these are really nasty because they're genotoxic, they're carcinogenic, immunosuppressive, and they can cause both acute and chronic toxicity depending on your exposure. So these days, crops from tropical or subtropical areas are generally affected more frequently and more severely by aflatoxin contamination, but it's really not a stretch to imagine this becoming a bigger problem in more temperate areas in the future due to climate change. So now on to methylmercury. And increases in water temperature can lead to increased rates of bacterial growth in water. And that together with sediments that are already in there convert mercury into methylmercury, which then accumulates in the food chain, gets into the fish. And of course, that's bad because methylmercury is highly toxic and can lead to a range of health problems depending on exposure. Now, also related to that last point in terms of impacts of higher water temperatures, these higher temperatures are also correlated to an increase in the frequency and extent of algal blooms globally. And these algal blooms, or specifically the harmful algal blooms, are characterized by the rapid growth of algae that can cause harm to animals, to people, to the local ecology, specifically the fish and the shellfish that can accumulate these toxins that are released by the harmful algal blooms. And if humans ingest even a small amount of contaminated seafood, they can experience serious health problems. And finally, a last example here to say that precipitation events, including flooding, can move pathogens through the environment and contaminate food sources like crops or livestock facilities. So you may be familiar with a recent example where we've seen lettuce contaminated with pathogenic E. coli, resulting in a serious outbreak, where it's been suggested that the source was water contamination from animal agriculture. And in fact, we saw several environmental samples of canal water in the area that were found to contain E. coli that genetically matched the same strain of bacteria that caused the outbreak. Now, in this situation, where you have an animal and a plant agriculture in relative proximity, it's not hard to imagine how increased precipitation leading to flooding could also then lead to contamination of irrigation water, for example. But on the flip side, even during droughts, contaminated dirt blowing into the fields as dust particles is also a possibility. So extreme weather events in different directions could definitely play a part in this complex interaction of food contamination. So now moving to the second mechanism about human exposure factors. These are also related to climate change and the climate variables I mentioned. So in temperate climates, as the summer season lengthens, some research has shown a greater number of food mishandling events leading to cross-contamination or undercooking and more foodborne illness. So increased food mishandling by consumers is sometimes due to differences in cooking practices. So for example, barbecuing outdoors is a common cooking technique in the summer months in some countries, which is also correlated to an increase in foodborne disease. Similarly, eating outdoors in a picnic environment, also facilitated by warmer temperatures, is sometimes associated with poor hand hygiene and longer exposure of foods to unsafe temperatures where bacteria can grow, resulting in foodborne illness. Finally, food preferences are also likely to change due to changes in food availability because of climate change. And different foods have different hazards associated with them. In some places, locally produced food may also become scarce because of climate change, and that might mean a greater reliability on imported foods. And so then we have to consider that problems caused by hazards in a local food supply in one country could easily evolve into a global situation where you have a food safety emergency involving multiple countries, introducing novel pathogens into human populations that were previously not encountered. Finally, climate change can impact foodborne diseases indirectly through increased activity, range, expansion, and reproduction rates of wildlife vectors, which can in turn result in changes to contamination patterns and subsequent foodborne disease. So wildlife vectors can transmit pathogens to food in a number of ways, and here I've just included 3 different examples of wildlife vectors to illustrate this. So first, let's consider forest-dwelling mammals like deer. So produce like lettuce or strawberries or other fruits or vegetables are generally grown in rural areas, and fields are susceptible to intrusion of wildlife such as deer, which are known carriers of human pathogens like E. coli, and have been responsible for contamination and illness events in the past. Next, plankton can play a role, and we know that Vibrio bacteria can be transmitted to oysters, for example, in marine environments through phytoplankton and zooplankton, and then cause illness upon human consumption. And then if we talk about rodents or insects, we know that the presence of rodents and insects, including beetles or flies or other bugs on farms, can be associated with an increased Campylobacter contamination in chicken broiler flocks. And so speaking of insects, you may be aware that East African nations have been battling with swarms of desert locusts since the beginning of 2020. And the situation now is being called the worst outbreak that this region has seen in decades, because it's really threatening food security and livelihoods across the region by destroying food crops. And the traditional way to control these pests would be the application of pesticides. But the impact of these chemicals on the environment and other critical ecosystems that are key to food security, like bees and other insects, can't be overlooked. And we have to consider what it means if increases in plant pests results in more chemical usage and the possibilities then of chemical residues entering the food chain, bringing with them their own potential food safety risks. So it's a really complicated situation. Altogether, the problems that we face, and I've just exemplified a few, they seem daunting. And the challenge of halting and reversing climate change is certainly bigger than any one country. And having said that, mitigating the health-related impacts of climate change is both possible and necessary. It means that globally, health authorities, in collaboration with their partners in agriculture, environment, and other relevant sectors, they really need to be able to prevent, detect, and manage the increased foodborne risks that are going to be associated with climate change, and then to do so in a way that advances health equity and ensures that no one is left behind. Now, there are several ways to do this, which are outlined in a recent publication from WHO. You can see here on the screen, titled Food Safety, Climate Change, and the Role of WHO. And I'm just going to quickly touch on 3 areas that I think are especially important. So the first area relates to monitoring and surveillance. First, we need to improve foodborne disease surveillance globally. The numbers that I quoted at the start of this presentation about the global burden of foodborne disease, these are just estimates, and they're based on data from 2010. Surveillance of foodborne diseases around the world is just simply not where it should be, and this needs to be the starting point if we're going to try and track the impact of climate change. We have to have a baseline. And of course, this can be similarly said for monitoring of water, soils, and foods, for contaminants and chemical residues, as well as crops for pesticide residues, animal products for veterinary residues, and we need improved and integrated systems for tracking emerging animal diseases and human diseases as well. And then all of these data need to be used to identify the trends, to inform our risk assessments, and really help to plan for future interventions to protect public health. The second area relates to preparedness and response to food safety incidents. In this regard, countries need to enhance their emergency preparedness response and capacity building to better be able to prevent and manage the threat from increased foodborne risks that are going to be associated with climate change. And these kind of requirements are all detailed in the international health regulations, which outline the necessary core capacities that are really needed to detect and respond to foodborne disease outbreaks and food safety emergencies. And the third and final area I want to mention is related to the international sharing of information, because climate change is a global problem, and it's going to take a global effort to overcome the challenges we're facing. And the International Food Safety Authorities Network, or InfoSan, is one tool that I hope you've heard of, which can help to facilitate global information sharing. And I won't get into the details, but this global network has members from national authorities across various sectors involved in food safety from more than 190 countries. And they're all exchanging information during international food safety incidents, but also offering each other support in terms of capacity building and sharing food safety information of global interest, creating partnerships. And this is all done in the spirit of taking a One Health approach with members from health, agriculture, veterinary services, environment, trade, standards, and more. So in conclusion, let me say first, climate change will increase the risks from existing and emerging foodborne diseases. Primarily, this is going to happen through increases in extreme events, increases in air and water temperatures, and changes to precipitation frequency and intensity. But it's also at the same time important to note that these trends regarding foodborne disease and climate change involve such complex systems with many interacting factors, and so there are still many uncertainties that need to be considered. Second, the prevalence of foodborne illness is likely to increase with climate change, and this is attributed to the anticipated increases in both the pathogens that already commonly cause foodborne illness, as well as the emerging pathogens, including those that could be spread through global food trade. And finally, WHO is committed to providing support to member states in order to prevent, detect, and manage these increased foodborne risks associated with climate change, and to do so in a way that advances health equity and ensures that no one is left behind. So if you'd like more information, I've included a few references here and a link to the document I mentioned from WHO, which is available in 6 official UN languages. And it's got more details about the topics I discussed and more about what we can all do together to help tackle this challenge. Thank you very much.
Yeah, as mentioned before, my name is Alwin van Oldenburg, and I will now talk about climate change and its impact on food production and disease management from a student's perspective. First of all, a big thank you to the World Veterinary Association for inviting a student representative to speak at this amazing event. And thank you to the New Zealand Veterinary Association and the World Veterinary Association for overcoming the huge challenge in having to organize this event online during this ongoing pandemic. To start, I think it's very important here to stress that as veterinary health professionals, we are also part of the One Health concept. And one aspect of One Health that is often forgotten about is environmental health, which will thus be the main focus of this presentation. I will also give a big overview of the problem at hand, just to reiterate that. Firstly, I will go into more detail about the main factors that are contributing to the man-made climate change, being reasons for increasing greenhouse gases due to burning fossil fuels. These include population growth, diet, land use, and carbon sequestering, and non-CO2 emitting energy sources partly offset this growth. I'll then speak about the consequences that this climate change can have and is already having on the world, being desertification, vector-borne disease threat, and heat stress due to climate zone shift and biodiversity loss, which is also partly caused due to habitat loss. The two main sources used for this presentation are the Special Report on Climate Change and Land by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, and the Assessment Report on Land Degradation and Restoration by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or the IPBES. I encourage you to check it out if you're interested in anything I say in this presentation, because they go into a lot more detail about everything. Firstly, a quick recap about the greenhouse gases themselves. Carbon dioxide is the one we all know, but there's more that are important to this problem. For example, CH4 or methane, which is on a 100-year scale, 28 times more potent than CO2, and N2O, which is on a 100-year scale, 265 times more potent than CO2. For easier comparison, usually they are converted to CO2 equivalents, as you can see in the graph on the right. On the right, you see the emissions caused by the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sectors. And as you can see, the methane emissions also almost amount for the same amount of greenhouse gas emissions as carbon dioxide. To put things into perspective, here are the total emissions per sector, and as you can see, energy production is still the biggest bulk and contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, with agriculture and land use coming second and third, respectively. As those are closer to the veterinary profession, I will be focusing more on agriculture and land use. The first factor contributing to increased greenhouse gas emissions is population growth. The world population has more than doubled in the past 50 years, and looking at the current projections, it could be close to 10 billion by 2050. One other important factor in population growth is that it's not equal all around the globe. Most of the growth is concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, with the population there projected to double in the coming 50 years. Since this region is also projected to be one of the most affected by climate change, this could pose a big challenge for the entire world. The second factor is diet. Meat production doubled between 1961 and 2017, according to research by the FAO, and is projected to rise by another 13% between 2018 and 2028. So that's only in 10 years. As you can see, there's also a very good development in the prevalence of underweight in the population going down. But unfortunately, there's also a counter trend in people with overweight or obese people going up. The third factor that I would like to focus a bit more on is land use and carbon sequestering by the soil. Currently, 70% of all ice-free land in the world is being used by humans in one way or another. How exactly it's being used, we will discuss later. And all of this land use lowers the carbon sequestering ability of the soil, which means that the soil won't absorb as much CO2. And the soil is now a very important carbon sink, as in the past 10 years, 30% of all the world's greenhouse gases were absorbed by the land through photosynthesis. So if this sequestering ability lowers, this can have a huge impact on greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. Agricultural land degrades the land a lot more than it forms. So the soil erosion can be 10 to even 100 times higher than the soil formation rate. Here you can see a breakdown of all the use of the global ice-free land, of which, as mentioned before, over 70% is used by humans. On the left, you can see the most intensive use of land by humans, and on the right, the least intense use of land. As you can see, a lot of it is not very intensively used, luckily, but it's still a lot of land that is being used by humans. A very important factor in how well land can take up carbon is how it's managed. As you can see, with degraded soil, there's actually more carbon coming out of the land than it's taking up. So the land is actually a net carbon source instead of a net carbon sink. Whereas if the land is managed sustainably, the land can be used as a carbon sink, taking greenhouse gases out of the air. Now onto the consequences of this climate change. The most important one being shifting climate zones, which will mean that the current climate zones will move away from the equator. As you can see in this graph, the world population by 2050 will be living in relatively more dry areas than there are today. Of course, the total world population is increasing, but as you can see, it's relatively increasing more in drier areas. The effects of climate change can also cause mass migration, which with projections going up to 50 million migrations by climate change by 2050, which are mainly due to desertification. The spread of vector-borne diseases, which was talked about earlier, is also projected to increase as they move with the shifting climate zones. The increase in extreme weather events because of the changing climate can have a big impact on the world population. Firstly, an increase in drought frequency and intensity can have a big impact on food production and can also increase the occurrence of wildfires, which could also, for example, be seen in Australia and the wildfires that raged there earlier. An increase in heat wave frequency, intensity, and duration is something that has already been seen and can cost human lives and animal lives. And extreme precipitation events, or just rain, can cause flooding as water runoff is harder to control. And also degraded soil can hold less water, increasing the runoff as well, which thereby increases the chance of flooding. This extreme precipitation can also cause for loss in crops. This is also a good point to talk about food production in general, as one could say that having a higher concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere would create a better environment for plants to grow, and thus crop production could be increased. This is true to a certain extent. However, it is expected that combining the higher drought frequency and intensity, more heavy precipitation events, and soil degradation, as the soil will contain less nutrients for plants to grow off, will more than offset this, and crop production is predicted to decline in the coming 50 years. I will keep the animal welfare part short, as we just gotten really good presentation from the speaker of the OIE. But there are two small things that I would like to mention, as the increase in temperature can cause a more heat stress in livestock, which will in turn cause the production to decrease. And also, as mentioned before, vector-borne diseases can spread more easily in a warmer climate, which can also lead to lower production in animals. One other aspect that, in my opinion, is not discussed enough is biodiversity loss. As can be seen in the right graph, there's also there has been a lot of biodiversity lost already, with another 10% projected by 2015 on the current path. One cause of this is land degradation again, and in the left graph you can see the loss in organic carbon, which is a parameter which you can use to see how much land has degraded. And as you can see, there's a lot of land degradation going on all around the world already. The main causes for biodiversity loss can be seen here. The main ones being habitat loss due to human development, for example, crops, pastures, managed forests, and infrastructure. And the other main reason being climate change. You also see here a thing called productivity decline. What that means is that some places of land will be less productive and have less biomass associated with them because of land degradation, because there's less nutrients available in this soil. Then I would also like to explain what SSP means. As you can see, there's 3 SSPs shown in the graph on the left. SSP stands for Shared Socioeconomic Path, which is a projection that is used to see what effects current socioeconomic paths will have on, for example, climate change, or in this case, biodiversity loss. SSP1 would mean high economic growth, low population growth, fast technology change, and a focus on environmental protection, and high international cooperation and low waste, whereas SSP3 is basically the opposite of this. So with a low economic growth, high population growth, low technology change, and no focus on environmental protection. As you can see, the difference between the SSP1 and the SSP3 scenario is really big. And this is something we will see later as well. One other important part of the biodiversity loss is that of the pollinators. They've been declining as well. Unfortunately, there is not that many good numbers available, especially on the invertebrate pollinators, but they have been seen to decline at least North America and Northwest Europe. This graph shows the percentage of expected agricultural loss in case we lose the animal pollinators. And as you can see, the loss of pollinators can have a really big impact on the agricultural sector, as they will experience huge losses. So I think it's very important to also look at the pollinators in this equation. And pesticides are a factor that pressures pollinators a lot, and they should, in principle, be avoided. All right, then on to the most important part, in my opinion. We can talk a lot about the causes of climate change and what we maybe should do, but the important part now is that we actually take action. This is a problem that is already affecting people today, and it will affect people even more in the near future. With the way things are currently going, we are essentially borrowing from the future, and it will come back to us at a very high interest rate, not only economically, but also in humanitarian way. Now onto the possible solutions. I'm not saying these are the exhaustive list of solutions, but there are some that I just wanted to point out. Firstly, in energy generation, as this is the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. I know this is not necessarily too relevant for the veterinary sector, but this is actually relevant for everyone, in my opinion, so everyone should do that. As an individual, you should try to use renewable energies like solar energy and wind energy, and also electrify your transportation and heating. And the government should stop subsidizing fossil fuels and instead stimulate low CO2 emission energy sources such as solar, wind, and wind energy. And also stimulate energy use reductions such as house insulation, which can have a big effect on the energy usage by a household. This will also stimulate electrification and try to find carbon storage solutions, which we will talk about a bit more later. As an individual consuming resources, food waste is also an important factor in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In the total food supply chain, currently 25 to 30% of all produced food is actually wasted. So even a small reduction in food waste can have a big impact on our greenhouse gas emissions. Also, more sustainable transportation and changing your food habits to include a bit more plant-based diet can help in reducing your greenhouse gas emissions. On the food production side of things, reduction in deforestation or even doing reforestations and the use of agroforestry, which is combining agriculture with forestry, so natural plants, can increase the carbon sinking ability of the soil, which we saw before. Instead of being a carbon source, the soil can be a carbon sink, taking away carbon from the atmosphere. Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is actually something that is not used widely right now, but is something that is in development, and governments should try to focus their research on the possibilities with that, as it can provide a relatively clean way of producing energy. As mentioned before, there are 3 commonly used socioeconomic pathways used as models to project the future. Here in the top graph, it is shown that risks of desertification, land degradation, and food insecurity will be a lot lower, even with a bigger temperature change in the SSP1 pathway than in the SSP3 pathway. Which means that if we follow the SSP1 pathway with the more focus on the environmental protection, that the risks of desertification, land degradation, and food insecurity will be lower than if there's less risk on that, less technology, less global cooperation. This also goes for food prices, as seen in the lower graph, and also for the % change in the population at risk of hunger. So in the SSP1 pathway, the increase of the population that is at risk of hunger is actually lower than the SSP3 pathway. So overall, a global cooperation is needed to combat this giant issue. Education about the issue at hand and possible solutions should be available for everyone, and people from all regions should be mobilized, as this is an issue that will affect everyone. There are some possible challenges, which could be citizens versus consumers. Research has shown that even though if citizens says they want to do something different, like be more sustainable, The consumer in the end will make a decision more based on price. And this is something where the government can intervene to make sure that the price difference between the sustainable and the non-sustainable alternative will be kept as low as possible. Also, when issues arise, sometimes people are looking for mere individualistic solutions instead of cooperating, and we need to make sure that we, as a species, cooperate against this problem that affects us all. And one other problem that is that there's recently been some pushback against the scientific community by people that don't believe this problem exists. I personally believe a lot of this can be solved through early education, where children get taught to think critically and look at sources when they read something, which could be a sort of media literacy course. So, in conclusion, man-made climate change is a problem that is affecting people today and will affect millions more in the future. Land use is a key factor in carbon emissions and sequestering. A change in mindset is needed, and a global response is needed to mitigate the effect, in which collaboration is key. Facing the challenge together, just like the global health crisis that we face right now, not only cooperation between countries, but also between different generations and educational backgrounds. So, for example, the One Health concept, and education should be available for all. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. I would like to start by thanking the World Veterinary Association for their kind invitation to speak on behalf of the World Medical Association about how the climate change impacts the human health and disease management. As mentioned by the Lancet in 2009, climate change is the biggest global health threats for the 21st century and can affect human health directly through such as high temperatures and extreme weather events, and indirectly due to ecological changes, vector-borne diseases, for example, malaria, water and food insecurity, and climate migration. Now, according to WHO, climate change is expected to cause 250,000 additional deaths per year, and this will cost the health sector around $2 to $4 billion per year by 2030. In my brief talk, I will be focusing on 4 main areas: air pollution, extreme temperatures, extreme weather events, and malnutrition. If we start with air pollution, it kills 7 million people worldwide every year, and 9 out of 10 people across the globe breathe air quality levels that exceeds WHO guideline limits. The most direct link between climate change and ill health for human health is air pollution. Increased temperatures and fossil fuel consumption all contribute to both indoor and outdoor air pollution. This is a picture from New Delhi that was taken last year in the city that was in toxic air and actually declared a health emergency. So these toxic levels have increased both morbidity and mortality of the city citizens. One of the chest surgeons who actually practicing in New Delhi, Dr. Arvind Kumar, has mentioned that when he treated patients with lung cancers 30 years ago, the majority of them were smokers. But now he is treating more than 50% of his patients are non-smokers and under the age of 30. In a report that was launched in 2018 by WHO, in which the World Medical Association has contributed in, about the linkages between air pollution and child health, this table presents the death rate per 100,000 children to the joint effect of air pollution in 2016 by region and income level. The highest levels are in low and middle income countries. If you look at Africa, Africa has a death rate of 118.1 under the age of 5 and around 12.9 for children between the age of 5 to 14 years. Extreme temperatures is one of the direct impacts of climate change. And with the current greenhouse gas emissions rates, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, has estimated a rise in global temperatures to reach 1.5 degrees by around 2040. So exposure to rising temperatures is associated with higher incidence of non-communicable diseases, like cardiovascular diseases. In Burkina Faso, for example, they conducted a 11-year study that has shown exposure to moderate or extreme heat significantly increased daily premature mortality from non-communicable diseases. Cardiovascular disease is accounted for 50% of years of life lost in this study. Kuwait, which is the country that I am originally from, is another example. So this picture was posted on Washington Post in 2019, representing the different temperature that was captured on the day of 22nd July 2016 in the Arabian Peninsula. And if we see this zone is completely in green, and the green color represents 130 Fahrenheit. That is around 54 degrees. At that time, I was a practicing emergency physician in one of the main hospitals in Kuwait. And July and August are one of the warmest months of the year, in which the emergency room gets overwhelmed and packed with patients presenting with heat stress, heat exhaustions, as well as heart disease, including heart attacks. There was a recent study conducted in Kuwait that estimated that when the 24-hour average temperature was extreme, that is 42 degrees and above, there is a 3 times greater risk of dying from any cardiovascular disease. If we move on to the extreme weather events, which is one of the great climate change health impacts. So one of the main drivers of those extreme weather events that we have noticed are increasing in both frequency and impact is climate change. Like extreme events now are killing an average of 60,000 per year, which is thousands in both poor and rich countries. The picture that's shown here on the slide is taken in Pakistan in 2010. So in Pakistan, over the last 40 years, they have noticed more than 90% of natural disasters affecting the country have been triggered by climate change. In 2010, over 15 million people have been affected by flooding, with 6 million people in need of urgent medical care. But the problem is that attending to those health needs was extremely difficult, as over 2,000 healthcare facilities were destroyed by the floods. Malnutrition is anticipated to be one of the greatest threats to health resulting from climate change, and both the young and elderly will be particularly affected. So the ecological shifts caused by climate change affecting water and sanitation and food security and malnutrition. Without action, climate change will impact the nutrition through decreased food quantity and access, decreased dietary diversity, and decrease in nutritional content. The World Food Programme estimated that by 2050, hunger and child malnutrition could increase by 20% due to the climate change. There are also some indirect linkages between nutrition and climate change. For example, there was a study in India that has shown that women exposed to drought in the year before she gives birth, she has a negative effect on her child's weight for age. Now I want to reverse the table a bit and speak to you how the healthcare sector contributes to climate change, which is an issue that is not always discussed and usually forgotten when we speak about climate change and health. There was a recent study that is led by Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany, which is one of the leading climate research institutions worldwide. They have mentioned that emissions from hospitals, health services, and medical supply chains across the OECD countries, including China and India, make up 4% of the global total emissions, and that is larger than either aviation or shipping. The relative dominance of healthcare was mainly as a reflection of the nation's wealth and population size. So as we see in the figure here, the Netherlands, US, Belgium, and Japan directing the highest share of their GDP towards it. But if we go to the health carbon footprint emission per capita, the highest would be USA, followed by Luxembourg. So in conclusion, the climate change has great impacts on health. And in order to address those risks, we need to build climate resilience health systems and public health services. And given that health is strongly influenced by effects on other sectors, such as food and water, for example, a multi-sectoral response and a One Health approach is needed, breaking silos across different sectors, which is health, sustainability, finance, trade, and so on and so forth. For building a climate resilient healthcare system, we really need to strengthen and build the health workforce, health information system, medical products and technologies, service delivery and leadership, and governance. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have during the panel discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Anthony. And just to recap for everyone, we've just listened to a number of excellent talks on the subject of our One Health Summit today on climate change. Our speakers have come from several different organizations. I really want to give a thank you to them. The World Health Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, FAO, World Medical Association, and the International Veterinary Student Association. So I want to thank our participants for their excellent talks. And we've come to the panel session portion of our discussion today. Just a reminder for any attendees that if you do have questions from any of the speakers' talks, or maybe a question for any or all of the panelists that you've heard today, please type them into the Q&A box, and we will do our best to get to them in the next few minutes. So now we are going to embark on a session to discuss some of these different questions, and we'll get started then on the first question that we have that's come through. So given that more than 75% of the global diseases that we see are zoonotic, and we have a number of foodborne diseases, how far have we gone systematically to address these challenges? And I guess this was originally addressed to the World Health Organization, but again, I'm happy to have any of our panelists respond to this.
Hi, this is Carmen here. I guess I'll start since it was directed about WHO structure. And it's a good question because WHO has been going through a transformation recently over the last 2 years. And this has resulted in a lot of shifts in how different areas are being addressed in different divisions. But I can assure you that One Health is taken very seriously at WHO. And there's various teams that are dealing with One Health issues, addressing AMR, addressing emerging infectious diseases. And a lot of those programs are working hand in hand with the FAO and with the OIE. And one of their flagship publications, which was put out last year, is a tripartite guide to addressing zoonotic diseases in countries. And that document talks all about taking a multi-sectoral One Health approach to addressing a lot of these issues. And so if you haven't seen that, I would recommend taking a look. But from our perspective, yes, we're big into the One Health approach at WHO.
That's great, Dr. Spelly. Does anybody else have any comments that they want to make on this?
If I may, Patricia, and just to build on Carmen's comments, the tripartite, the One Health tripartite, as we call it, OIE, WHO, FAO, this is a long-standing collaboration in One Health. Originally built around 3 focus areas: rabies, zoonotic influenza, and antimicrobial resistance. But in the last 2 years, broadened out to really encompass a whole of system approach in terms of health services strengthening, the capacity for response across many areas. And the international organizations, I always like to think of it that what we're trying to do is model the sort of collaboration that we really want to see in One Health at the national level and even at the local level. So the organizations involved across competencies for animal health, human health, and ecosystem health working together on specific practical problems. And this is the key thing. It needs to be action oriented around specific priorities that have a local or a national context.
Great, thank you. Okay, we'll move on to another question then. And this is related to agriculture. So the question is that reductionist approach on which global agriculture is based are the main drivers of climate change by producing large-scale desertification due to soil exposure. Agriculture has become chemically driven and not about biology. You know, what can be done about this? Is this being addressed by the WHO, FAO, or others?
So it's Carmen here. Maybe again, I'll just start by saying, you know, from WHO's perspective, what we of course want to encourage is a sustainable food system. And of course, some of these issues fall under that idea, but a lot of the food safety activities we do are done in close partnership with FAO. And so I think for this particular issue, it's probably the kind of work that's more under the remit of FAO.
Daniela, do you want to address this?
Yes, indeed. Yes, Carmen. Okay. Yeah. Well, FAO is truly addressing this topic and giving a wide range of advice and policy strategies to increase the sustainability of agricultural practices. One of the approach which is currently more widely supported is, for instance, agroecology. So looking at all the different possibilities to develop agriculture in a sustainable way. So therefore, trying not to deplete natural resources and the soil, for instance. Last year, for instance, was the year of the soil. So we gave a particular importance of all those practices that enrich the health of the soil. I mean, again, talking about One Health, and again, we could not speak about everything here. We've been talking about the health of human beings and animals and the environment as a whole, but the health of the soil is extremely important because in turn, it does influence, for instance, the health of pasture, grazing, but also all the other agricultural production So therefore, not only the livestock, but of the agricultural production on its own. Again, I don't think we have the time now to go into detail of what are the good practices, but agroforestry is one of those, agroecology, and as I said, there is a wealth of information looking at the health of the soil and the whole ecosystem related to agriculture. I would invite the person, for instance, to have a look at the FAO website, and if the person has any particular specific question, can address me, and I'm not an expert on that, but I'm happy to put him or her in contact with our agricultural specialist or soil fertility specialist and so on.
Great, thank you, Daniela. Okay, so we will move on to our next question, and is that, do the agencies use the standardized approach for climate change prediction? Not sure who may want to tackle that. Okay, we will move on then. Maybe that answers the question. Okay. Do the panelists feel that veterinary education systems around the world are enabling veterinarians to provide good value in the field of food sustainability? Maybe Matthew or Daniela?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to start the discussion on this one. Veterinary education systems are really at the heart of when we think of the professional capacities and competencies that we want to build, and the contribution that the profession wants to make internationally. And so the OIE has been active in development of what is known as the day one competencies for a standardized approach to ensuring a comprehensive education of veterinarians when they graduate. But of course, that's just the start. We want to build into our profession the capacity for lifelong learning. And so continuous development, which is typically in the hands of national veterinary associations when we're talking about clinical practice. But for official veterinarians, as we say, government veterinarians, the OIE is particularly active in 8 areas at the moment where our delegates are supported by what we call focal points in 8 specific areas. I won't name them all, but they go from laboratories to animal welfare to animal health surveillance and notifications, and a variety of other areas, aquatic animal health as well. And the OIE is in fact really modernising our service offering in this space by developing what we're calling the OIE training platform, which is bringing all of our training resources online, where it's a gradual and soft launch of this to ensure that we're helping official government veterinary services develop the capacities. And this goes from very technical capacities all the way through to strategic and leadership capacities that are going to be important to ensure the profession makes its full impact in the challenges that we're facing.
Great, thank you, Matthew. Daniela, did you want to comment?
Yeah, well, actually, I was just thinking that I don't like to have questions not being replied, so I just wanted to go back to the question before, like if the organization are having a kind of common approach to measure climate changes and its implication. Well, actually, at the United Nations, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is the organization that is looking at the particular topic of climate change. Being a UN organization, it means that both FAO and WHO are very much coordinated with it, but then also because through the tripartite that Matthew and Carmen were mentioning before, the 3 organizations, FAO, WHO, and OIE, are trying to have a common approach, a coordinated approach to many of the topics we are dealing. Then it means that we try also to coordinate as much as possible our effort and trying to also to try to harmonize our measurements. As Matthew was saying, climate change is not one of the specific topics of higher attention within the tripartite, but definitely we try to coordinate our work there. And as I say, that the IPCC is the organization that is standardizing, if you want, the monitoring of climate change and the measurements. I think it might be an answer for the previous question. And I think the other one, I think Matthew has addressed already. Thanks.
That's great, thank you. The next question is addressed to FAO. So Daniela, does the increase in resilience to animal production systems include the supply chain? And in particular, they were looking at, the discussion is on the problems of intensive systems and abattoirs and processing plants.
Yeah, normally when our work is throughout the whole of the value chain, so we take into account also the supply chain. What was mentioned in the last presentation, for instance, was the importance of decreasing food losses and wastes. That's also one of the way to increase the efficiencies and the resilience of the system % to make it more sustainable. That's one of the strong focus of FAO work, so trying to, again, giving policy advice and enabling all the actors within the value chain, addressing that matter and trying to reduce as much as possible. So that, of course, for what regards the wastes, it looks very much at the one end of the supply chain, so more the retailers and the retailers itself. So that's one of what we take into account, and of course, at slaughterhouse level, again, we have worked a lot in developing good practices for the meat industry. Trying to address the food safety problems there, again, decreasing the losses, mainly in less economically developed countries, and the wastes at developed countries level. So again, yes, we do work throughout the whole food value chains.
Great, thank you. Part of the challenge sometimes in reading questions is trying to interpret what participants were, intending. So I apologize if any of the attendees have inputted questions that I'm not interpreting appropriately. But this is a panel, I want to remind everyone, predominantly on climate change and its impacts as it applies to One Health. We do have some COVID-19 questions that are coming in here, and if we have time, we'll come back to those afterwards. But I do want to ensure that we address the initial questions on climate change first. So that's just to let everybody know. Another question for you, Daniela, on what your opinion is on holistic grazing, and again, how this impacts animal production and climate change mitigation.
I think, as I mentioned briefly, of course, in my presentation, good grazing management is, again, extremely important, and the pasture management as such. Making sure that the grazing, the pasture resources are well used by the animals is one way to decrease carbon emission. And unfortunately, certain times is not possible to do that through the available resources. That's why looking at silvopastoral agroforestry methodologies could help, but also we have to look at the possibility of using feed additives that would increase the digestibility and the efficiency, the energy efficiency of pasture and grassland. So looking at all those aspects, and again, putting in an agroecological context, the pasture and the grazing lands is a way to address the issue in a more sustainable way.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I'm just taking a look through here. Maybe as I'm looking at some of these more recent ones that are coming in, I also have a couple of questions as well that maybe people may consider answering. We've heard from all of our panelists today that climate change is a complex problem that requires attention from a number of parties at a national, regional, and international level. We have on this call today, though, many veterinarians who may be involved in their own practices in different countries around the world. Sometimes some of these problems related to climate change seem distant from individuals. What can veterinarians do in their day-to-day life and practice to contribute and support mitigation for some of these climate change effects?
I think it's if I may start, it's a very important question because it's easy for us to feel a little bit helpless when we're faced with such global challenges that we know require a global response. But I think I like to fall back to the old saying, think global, act local. And I enjoyed Elwyn's presentation and his emphasis on these aspects of acting local and all of us assuming some responsibility for and let's make it specific to veterinarians and business. So all business owners should be examining their own efficiency and their sustainability practices. That's something that we can do. But let's also appreciate that veterinarians act as important advisors for farmers and the producers in the food system. And that advice, as was pointed out before, if we're reducing wastage associated with health loss, which is absolutely key, then we're improving the overall efficiency of the system. So I think it's easy for us to see veterinarians as important actors in this whole process of mitigating the drivers, but also responding to the impacts of climate change.
Great, thank you, Matthew. Any comments from anyone else on that issue?
Yeah. Yeah, I think Matthew summed it up really well. Yeah, think globally, act locally. Also, in addition to that, I would say just talk to people about it. And when you talk to people, I feel, especially in the younger generation, I noticed that basically everyone sees climate change as a really big problem. And this is also why movements have started. For example, we have had a lot of climate protests from school children here in the Netherlands. And I think starting off these movements when people realize they are not alone in thinking something like this, that can get a much bigger trend going.
Great, thank you. Okay. We have another comment that it seems that infectious disease ecologists would provide a helpful service to veterinary public health because they think about animal parasite interactions within their environment and how climate change can impact these interactions. Are disease ecologists considered and included as part of the overall healthcare team?
I'm sure we'll all be in agreement here. I mean, when we're thinking about interdisciplinary approaches, we're needing to pull all the expertises together. And the ecologists, and specifically infectious disease ecologists, the understanding, the systems understanding, the way ecological systems operate at local and regional levels in particular. These are really important skills and perspectives to bring to any specific context. And every national or global disease control program that we design starts with a very clear understanding of the local epidemiology and ecology of that infectious disease. Whether it's an ongoing emergence from wildlife or the establishment of reservoir species and domesticated animals and their spillover into human health impacts, understanding how the system is operating and bringing all the expertise together. But I mean, I don't see that as a particular gap or absence. I think that's well appreciated. One of the things that I'd like to emphasize is that when we're considering what we often view as deeply technical and scientific issues, often it's the socio-economics that gets ignored in the equation, and all of these issues start with behavioural change. Typically, the response to these issues requires some element of behavioural change, and so understanding socio-economic drivers is probably the big space where we need to reach out and draw in the expert practitioners in those fields to really round out our interdisciplinary approach.
Great. Thank you. And I think that in part maybe addresses this next question, which is on tackling the difficulties of adaptive versus technical challenges, and trying to develop a practical way forward to deal with wildlife, wet markets, and associated health, welfare, and food security challenges, as well as long-distance animal transport. But I wonder if you have any, other comments related to that, maybe Matthew or Daniela on those issues. Sort of, is there a practical way forward that we can, agree to?
Well, the mention of wildlife supply chains and wet markets sort of gets us into a little bit of the territory that we're all starting to turn our minds to with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me first of all say that the issues right now confronting the world result from the human-to-human transmission associated with the current pandemic cycle. And I don't want to divert from the extraordinary work that WHO and medical services are doing internationally. But eventually, we need to turn our mind to what we're coming to understand as some of the root causes there. And bringing this whole, understanding how these value chains are operating and what are the drivers in them, and the fact that we have livelihoods at stake, and people can't just respond to regulatory bans and expect the whole system to turn off. We have to understand how systems are operating, where are the drivers, we have to provide alternatives to livelihoods, we have to educate all the actors along this, and we have to introduce science-based risk management, and let's face it, that might entail allowing a certain level of activity to happen, but under carefully controlled requirements that safeguard the risk that's being generated in these systems. So very challenging issues, but systems thinking, systems understanding, bringing all the stakeholders together, the co-design of solutions. These are the approaches that adaptive challenges require.
Great, thank you, Matthew. Anybody else care to comment on that?
I think Matthew has given a very good good analysis of that. I would just add that behavioral changes are also something to add. So looking at which kind of behaviors are leading to certain problems and looking how to change those behaviors. And I think he has also mentioned all the other things to look at to address the problem.
That's great. Thank you, Daniela. The other part for the question that was given there relates to the discussion about insect transmitted disease and arthropod-borne disease. You know, insects are big parts of our ecosystems. They play roles from pests to their incredible importance in pollination, and they're also a food source for people as well as animals. So in all of our discussions and concerns about insects and disease transmission, you know, how are we also considering the role of insects in our food systems for the future, and what is the role of the veterinarian within this business of insects?
Maybe I can try to answer that one, because we are definitely looking very closely at the use of insect, and also not only as food, but especially as feed. There are many issues there. There's still a lot to investigate and a lot to talk about. First of all, the energy efficiency. It's very important what insects are fed on, so that they're not becoming another competitor together with the bigger animals and human beings towards the same resources. So most of the time, the use of insect is looked within an approach into the circular bioeconomy. So looking at them to be fed into resources that are not being used by other animals or human beings. But when we do that, we have to look into possible pathogens entering or other hazard entering the food chain, so posing problems either of food safety but also of animal health. So that's something to look very carefully. So that's a lot going on for the time being, looking at really what are the different the possible hazards, and what are the way to produce insect and to use insect that could be beneficial in animal production, but still not posing a risk nor to the animal, nor to the food of animal origin. We are currently working at gathering expert information on that and trying to produce some guidelines on the production and use of insect. I know, for instance, also Codex Alimentarius, which is an organization that has the task to give recommendation and developing standards, food safety standards, has also been asked by its member countries to address that topic more from either directly from to the use of insect as food, or also as feed, and in any way entering the food chain. So that's a topic currently under our attention, but we definitely think that within the circular bioeconomy, and also looking at the different protein alternative, it's something that deserves attention, but provided it's done in a safe way, again, for animals and human beings.
Great, thank you.
Patricia, if I might just add a few comments there. Excellent answer from Daniela. In fact, when I saw the question, I regretted the 3 slides that I deleted from my presentation to try and just keep it as short as possible, because I was going to reference some work that the OIE has undertaken in relation to international trade in insects for food and feed. It's actually quite a interesting and difficult industry to find out information about, because there are a lot of countries now engaging in international trade in insects, both live insects and various insect products. And so we used a snowball sort of sampling technique to try to gather information from the various actors and discover what are the countries engaged in importing and exporting insects as food and feed. In doing so, we actually uncovered such a diverse array of insect species that are being traded internationally. Probably about 5 years ago, the international trade in insects overtook the well-known trade in international trade in bees for pollination services. So there is a wide variety of products being traded internationally, and quite alarmingly, I guess, a large number of species that are capable to act as infectious disease vectors are being traded internationally under probably, we hope, national level regulatory frameworks, but at this stage there aren't international standards that standardise the risk management in this trade. So this is certainly an area that the OIE, working cooperatively with our other international organisation partners, is thinking about what role we might play in risk management for this growing trade, the growing international trade, in particular in live and.
Great, thank you, Matthew. Okay, our next question from an attendee noted in the OIE talk that the foodborne disease surveillance data presented was from a decade ago, and that further work is necessary to build up food surveillance data gathering systems around the world. So what are the key priority areas that countries in the veterinary profession should look at to help build capacity in this particular area?
Patricia, I mean, the question referenced OIE, but I'm wondering if it was in relation to Carmen's presentation on behalf of WVA.
Yeah, I wonder that too. Carmen, do you maybe want to tackle that?
Well, look, I mean, I think the point I was making was really to just emphasize the fact that the surveillance systems are simply not up to scratch, really. And at a global level, at WHO, we're not collecting data on an annual basis on the range of foodborne diseases that we know are causing problems in the same way that we're collecting data on other infectious diseases. And so the point that I was making there was really to say that we need to start somewhere and start collecting this data if we're going to try to identify the trends that we're seeing and to know if the interventions that we're putting in place are making a difference. And in doing this, of course, I would advocate for an integrated surveillance model where you have all the different sectors pooling their data and working together to analyze the trends and inform their risk assessments. And then I would pass that over then to our veterinary colleagues who can probably speak a bit more then to the roles of veterinarians in that process.
Okay, great. Thank you. And so our next question really relates to maybe potential areas for research, and obviously it's a very big issue, but this is a very complex topic. It needs involvement of several stakeholders, and this individual had research questions. He wondered whether we could, panelists could say something about designing practical research activities around this issue of climate change and foodborne diseases.
So it's Carmen here. I think what I would say as a starting point would be to really involve the different sectors or the different expertise areas from the beginning in trying to identify the research questions that need to be asked. And so to get people from environmental health, from animal health, from human health, together from the beginning to address, to discuss and find out what needs to be addressed and where the starting points are, but really to determine altogether from the beginning the directions to take together, and really getting that input from all the sectors from the start, I think would be a really effective way to design some useful research going forward.
Great, thank you, Carmen.
And if I might add a few comments, and my comments will be coming from an infectious diseases perspective, which is really in relation to the OIE mandate. but I'd really like to give a plug for an international collaboration that's called STAR-IDAS, the International Research Consortium, STAR-IDAS, IRC, and they have a great website where a full range of infectious disease priorities, but including thematic priorities like antimicrobial resistance, have been identified by a broad membership. OEE forms the secretariat of this group in collaboration with the United Kingdom government. And across each of these areas, there's a process of developing research roadmaps. So identifying what are the specific priorities in these areas. These roadmaps are published, and then the membership of this group encompasses the research funding organisations at national level, but also philanthropic organisations like I mentioned before, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who are participating in this forum as well. So this idea of how do we get an international system of research focus on the most important stuff. And so together, coming up with these research roadmaps that are then positioned by the funding agencies within their national or whatever domains they're operating in, for then the efforts by the benchtop or the field scientists. And then, of course, we rely on the system of the international science systems of publication, peer review, and to bring all that knowledge forward for then consideration again in international standard setting or development of international research, programmatic activity and different global disease control programs or whatever. So this is a little insight into how we're trying to coordinate international efforts around R&D.
Great, thank you. And so we are coming close to the end of our time for this panel. We probably only have time for a couple more questions, and I'm going to try to hit some areas that we haven't really discussed so far. So we have another general question on how can we bring more human physicians on board with the One Health initiative. Are there any medical schools out there that have successfully brought in a curriculum for this? And I'm not sure if Lujane is still with us.
Yeah, hi, I'm here. Sorry, I had to call in through my phone because I was disconnected. That's a very good question. Well, the World Medical Association in general is involved in the One Health initiative, and we've actually talked about it a lot in our initiatives and projects toward climate change and other global challenges. But in regards to the second part, unfortunately, it's yet to be addressed in medical schools, and that is one of the things that we're trying to change, together with the International Federation of Medical Student Association, to not even have as part of the medical schools, but also as part of the capacity building toward training the junior doctors as well as the physicians.
Great, thank you. And I think our last question for this panel group is related to something that was also mentioned in Lujane's presentation. So noted that medical healthcare facilities account for 4% of the greenhouse gas emissions, higher than aviation and other industries. Do we know how this relates to the veterinary profession? And what could veterinarians do in their practice to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
If I can just address the first part of the question. Unfortunately, the study did not account the emission from the veterinary health sector, but it would be interesting to see how we put those numbers together, if this is something the WVA is interested to lead, to actually figure out the studies and the carbon emissions coming from the veterinary healthcare and combining it with the human health. So so we can see the total emissions from the healthcare sector, both the human health and the vet health together.
That's great, thank you. So I think we've gone just a little bit over time in our panel today, and there are obviously still, there are many unanswered questions still, so this is a topic which attendees are really passionate about. And we don't have a mechanism. We'll take a look through some of these and see if there's a way that we can address these again for attendees after this session. And in wrapping up this session, I really, again, want to thank our panelists from the World Health Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, the World Medical Association, and the International Veterinary Student Association for great talks and for your participation throughout this. We've had many, many attendees today, and this is obviously a topic of great interest. So at this point, I'd like to say that this concludes WVA's One Health Summit on climate change. And I'd like to thank all of our, in addition to our speakers, all of those helping to support this session from Webinar Vet, as well as our sponsors and our collaborators from the New Zealand Veterinary Association. And I know I'm really looking forward to all of the different sessions that will be ongoing over the next several weeks. So I encourage again everybody to take advantage of this unique opportunity to participate in this virtual World Veterinary Association Congress. So thank you very much again for your support and for your attendance today.